I think it's right. Yeah, it says we're live. So welcome everyone to another edition of the Perception and Action Journal Club. It's my real pleasure today to be joined by Keith Davids from Sheffield Hallam University. Let me shut off my email. And Shawn Myszka from Emergence. Both are who I've interviewed before on the podcast, and would happily talk to you in any time. We just said what we're imagining this would be is we just were at a conference and we attended Keith's presentation, and the three of us decided to go out for a meal and a drink afterwards and chat. And hopefully you can listen in and other people can join. So if you're following along in either YouTube or anything else, if you post questions in the comments, I can pull them in, and well, maybe near the end of what we're talking about, we can address some of those. But what we wanted to do, the main thing, we just want to use this as a starting point to kind of springboard into wherever this goes. But what we wanted to do is start by focusing on kind of Keith's talk. If for those of you that didn't hear it, I took a slide from it. Let me see. Hold on. Let me get one of Keith's images up here. There we go. Okay. So Keith gave a talk last Friday talking about, and I'll kind of my very brief summary of it, moving away from this dichotomy that we've created between very sport-specific specialized training, which is at the one end of that continuum Keith's drawn, and more generalized training of kind of general abilities, not as specific to a sport. And over time, we've kind of moved toward this dichotomy that you have to pick one or the other, right? You fall into two camps. The main point Keith was making was that there's no reason we have to pick one or the other. We can there's times and appropriate times to use both of these. And one of them is right now, right? When doing very sport-specific training is difficult for a lot of athletes, and depending on your sport. So so that's kind of the main springboard for this. And what I wanted to start with, Keith and Shawn, is one of the comments you made, Keith, I think was a really good one, is that being kind of at the general end of this continuum takes a lot of understanding and nuance. There's a lot to do it well, right? It's not just doing any old thing, right? Anyone can do that, the really specific, right? That's just make your practice almost like the game. Not anyone, but it's a bit easier. Going further to the right on this continuum, it gets more difficult. So what I wanted to start with, maybe I'll start with Keith. So what are some of the key points of how to do generalized training effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question to start with, Rob. So essentially, as you looked at that continuum, it's the right-hand side of the continuum, and normally the notion is that the more time you spend at the right-hand side of that continuum, then the learning curve will be less steep. You won't be making the most effective use of the time. So, if you really are focused on specificity of training and practice and learning, and you're at the kind of specialist end, then obviously spending time at the left-hand side, as you look at it, of that continuum, the representative side of it is quite important. But somewhere along the line, well, I know exactly where because we're writing a paper on it, like a lot of scientific research, this specificity generality issue got framed as a debate. And as scientists, we've got to put our hand up to that. Yeah. We like a debate. We like to frame things as an either or, a dualism. And there's so many dualisms in science, like there's the notion of fundamental versus applied research, genes versus environment. And of course, when you look at things, and to go back to your question, Rob, when you look at things, you take a good nuanced look at things and really try to understand what we're talking about here. It's more it's a timing issue, really. It's more a case of understanding when you should be at the specificity end in training and practice, learning, and when you could be at the generality end. So it takes it away from an either or, one side is right, one side is wrong, and more of it requires more of a nuanced understanding, which is driven by the needs of each individual athlete.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just pause there so you guys can chip in.
Yeah, before I get to you, Shawn, I wanted to ask one point. I was about the timing issue. I think when you refer to that, I know you're referring to timing in terms of where you are in acquiring this or the skill level, right? Probably more general, the earlier, more elite, more specified. But does this also apply for kind of on a macro scale too as well? I know, like we on the podcast have been talking a lot about periodization of skill acquisition. So do you think it also applies on the, like, if you're an experienced athlete, are there still times when you should move, maybe relative to competition, when you should move from general to specific? What do you think about that?
I can see Shawn's chomping at the bit to answer that, but I'll just get my I'll just get my 2 pennies worth in. It is that, and that's a really good point about timescales. There are different timescales that are in operation, and generally, if you look at things theoretically, the idea is that earlier in learning, a lot of these contemporary models, such as the athletic skills model, nonlinear pedagogy, advocates it. And as I mentioned before, the Russian sports science from people like Anatoly Bondarchuk, they're talking about the unity, the sort of integration of both approaches, and spending a bit more time in the foundational phase in what he called general physical preparation, and then you can specialize with more specific physical preparation. And by physical, we obviously mean performing and practice in sports. We don't actually just mean physical movements, because there's the perceptual side, the cognitive side, and things like that. And so we need to get away from this. You've done that general bit. Now you go to the specific training. You're now in that specialist phase. You can move up and down that continuum. That was a point that I'd made as well, depending on the needs of each individual and where they are, and their needs might, it might be due to aging, it might be due to injuries, illness. They might need to refresh themselves on that sort of general, what I call athletic enrichment. So I'll pause there, and maybe Shawn might want to add something.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, first off, Keith, it's not just the theory or the theoretical side that is guilty of this debate. I often have been guilty of it as well, sort of drawing this distinction between general versus specific, especially with how much I go on in regards to representative task design and learning design, specifically within my environment with my athletes. And to speak to Rob's point, there was a reason why at this year's Sport Movement Skill Conference, we were going to do a roundtable, or we still probably will to a certain degree, do an organized roundtable around skill acquisition periodization over the year or the annual phase, because I released an article back at the beginning of March where I discussed how early in the offseason and then throughout periods of time, maybe no more microcycles within that year, for an elite level NFL player, how I would typically utilize more general activities. And people were like, whoa, pumping the brakes. Like, I thought you were this representative learning and task design guy where the game has to, or the task has to look, feel, and act like the game. And I had to explain this sort of behind the scenes for a lot of individuals as to why I use some of those more general activities and how it can actually complement the more specific movement problem solving activities of that respective performer. And I think that's where you did a really good job illustrating some of those ideas, why we may have to come back, because there is going to, the movement system still is nonlinear, and it could still have positive contributions, those general activities, to the more specific, more functional problem solving activities of sport. And I think that's really a good thing to continually unpack and talk about. If one of our objectives is to create more functional movement problem solvers, degeneracy or abundance will precede dexterity or the ability to solve any respective problem. And if we're really going to become more attuned or more adaptable, we probably have to have more abundance of movement solutions, and we have to potentially address those more frequently, even in elite level athletes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it made me think of what both you were saying. Another way I see this dichotomy manifested is in training between what S&C, strength and conditioning people, and skill people, right? strength and conditioning is general, non-sport specific. Usually, skill is where you focus on the sport. And I think I've been trying to say this a long time. I think we can get a lot of out of connecting them, right? And that's one reason why you might want a fairly skilled athlete to go more general, is when maybe you identify they're missing opportunities, and you identify maybe it's due to some of their action capabilities. If I worked on their speed, they might see that opening and take advantage of that opening better. So I think those are great points.
Really good point there. When you look at the literature on motor development, and this is with regards to scores on tests, I'm not a big fan of motor development tests. So again, it's sort of, this pandemic tends to turn things upside down, but it's interesting to look at things. And so typically, I don't place great store on a lot of those motor development tests, because I think they're a bit reductionist and isolated in terms of movement. But when you look at them over the last 40 years, and every so many years, they take scores and they look at cohorts of children developing the movement skills of these children. They're going down. They're going down. So, because life's changing, environment, the culture, socio-cultural constraints are changing. So it does actually reinforce the fact that we may need to. So there's that time scale, is what I'm saying, that motor development time scale over many, many years. And the talent pool might be shrinking. In other words, the good movers, they may not be coming in as really good movers as they used to be. And so, you can put them on in a gym, as you're saying, Rob. They could have the fitness and strength and conditioning training, gym-based strength and conditioning, etc. But all the sort of movement skills where it's integrated with the strength and the endurance and the speed, the agility, stuff that Shawn knows far more than I do about. That side of things, there's evidence that it's missing now, it's diminished. And so we might need to do more of this sort of stuff, this integration of strength conditioning and skills-based work at that foundational level, to get people to a level where they can then really become empowered by the specialized training. But I'm quite optimistic. I think that I'm coming across a lot of people that are quite open-minded about this and really get this idea from their own observations, and so they really are trying to get away from the sort of repetitive, reductionist, drill-based stereotype movement patterns, rather than people enhancing their functionality, solving problems, making decisions, choices, and using movements to express themselves.
Yeah. And I think, like, for my mind, like a concrete example is that your kind of like your athlete skill model. Instead of having kids do chin-ups and sit-ups, and let's develop the same abilities in parkour or something like that, where you're learning to move and developing the physical attributes underlying it at the same time.
And so much more fun. You won't get this sort of here we go again. I hate training, I know it's good for me and all that, but you can add choices, decisions, problems to solve. And you were saying before, Rob, about your kids and boredom being an issue at the moment there, but they just love those little challenges and problems.
Definitely. I guess the next way, maybe I'll start with you, Shawn, this time. So if we turn to the what, right? So, if we're opening up this training to more generalized things, I don't think we're saying anything, right? Anything we can do, anything's going to help. If you have an athlete, a football player at home, and they can skip, run, they could go on computer and do a reaction time training. There's tons of generalized things they can do. How do we advise, and what kind of the principles do we use to know what kind of is going to connect with that continuum and that specific training?
Well, and it's funny that you say that, because that was probably the biggest question that I got after people listened to Keith's presentation on Friday, knowing that his ideas and thoughts align very closely to what mine do. And the biggest thing for me that I've tried to use as an experience is, something that Keith said earlier in regards to maybe this sort of honest expressing of oneself throughout movement. I think we have to look at activities where the individual actually gets to behave and interact with their environment, and the environment presents something that's maybe more alive or allows more abundance in the movement solutions to be addressed, or to then quote unquote be acquired or adapted to that environment. And I think that's where we see maybe parkour acting as more of a donor type of sport, right? We could even see things like martial arts impacting some other sports. We could see things like capoeira, or maybe some of the Feldenkrais method, or some of the Ido Portal stuff, Erwin Lacour's natural movement activities, these types of things, I think, where you get a chance and an opportunity to really connect to the perceptual informational variables that are out there that may be more alive or present problems in a more repetition without repetition fashion. I can't believe that it took me 15 minutes and 2 answers to get to repetition without repetition. But really what we find there, I think that's where the idea of learning to move kind of starts to shine, right? Mm-hmm. Where an individual performer gets the opportunity and gets presented with a problem that contains information that must regulate or guide their movement. And I think that's the biggest thing. That's why I have to be careful here, of course, but the agility ladders and the cone drills and things like that, yes, they're on the general side of the spectrum, but likely they're not going to have a whole lot of positive transference or carryover to the more specific movement skills, at least as that athlete moves up in levels of mastery or goes across that time scale. So I think it really depends on how alive that problem is, that information that must guide or regulate their movement, and the individual having or being presented with the opportunity then to perceive in their own authentic way, to decide in their own authentic way, and then ultimately to act in their own authentic way.
That's good. That's really eloquent, Shawn, as usual. The thing is that for me, the link between generality and specificity of practice is so-called synergy formation, which your Bernstein, the repetition without repetition, the insight there. Essentially, he talked about synergy formation being fundamental to people's interacting with the environment. And that's what generality and general practice at the general end should enhance people's ability to keep on forming synergies. And so, the problem with the drills and the cones going in a straight line and the ladders is you develop a synergy for that, and then you're not really allowed to adapt it because it's all the same. It's quite a symmetrical environment. Whereas if you add a bit of variability in and some problems, and as you kind of hinted at the beginning there, you pose questions of your athletes, but don't ask them to respond with a verbal response as they would in everyday life. It's with this sort of perceptual, physical, cognitive type of response that you're after. And you adapt that so that they're constantly practicing forming and reforming synergies to utilize the affordances, the opportunities that the environment provides them with. And then when they get to the specialized end of things, the synergy formation, that's what they're good at. That's a strength. So that, for me, that's the fundamental basis of learn to move. Synergy formation, using perception and utilizing affordances from the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that there's a lot of good stuff there. Before I get to synergies in a second, I wanted to go to what you mentioned, affordances, Keith. Do you think, one way that we can guide this is by looking kind of for what you might call overlapping affordances, right? So general activities that you have to learn to use space effectively, or general activities that you have to learn to deal with approaching object, and you know what I mean? So maybe you can't do the exact same thing, but you can touch on the same kind of opportunities in a general way, using time, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Essentially, in representative learning design, the affordances would be highly specific to a particular environment. So, for example, in a team game like soccer, you would learn how to use the affordance of a defender's weaker foot to exploit that space on the wrong side of the defender, or the closing distance between two defenders in order to decide whether you're going to pass the ball through or accelerate through with a dribble. And that's the highly specialized, a specific end, which is important. So to become, that's something that we must remember to mention, is that specific practice is really important at that specialized end. But it's this is what I meant by the timing issue that you picked up on, Rob. But beforehand, you can practice a lot of things that, if you like, set you up to use those affordances. So you kind of explore the affordance landscape that might be, as you say, overlapping, but might be near that particular field. And sometimes, like in the current situation where we have the lockdown of the English Premier League, football league, and so players can't practice together, then they've got to really, they're really in a phase of skill maintenance rather than skill acquisition or adaptation, whatever you like to call it. And so really they've got to be quite creative about seeking affordances that might be similar to the ones that they ideally would like to explore.
Yeah. Shawn, did you have any?
Yeah, and there's really something to that. I was challenged, obviously, with the quarantine and the coronavirus, and obviously my individual NFL players were in the middle of essentially where our tasks were representative or more representative. We had a number of individuals in groups. Obviously, we were constraining to afford. We were setting up certain problems that behave and act a little bit more like they would in American football. It wasn't 11 on 11, but typically we're talking about more small-sided games or slices of the game, snippets of the games that were being created or crafted by me as a problem designer for them to interact with. And of course, then some of the lockdown stuff happened and my guys were sent off, and obviously we could no longer get together and do things the way that we had been doing it. So it required all of us as sort of this shared partnership to come together and come up with as many ideas as we could. Some guys have dogs who they would play around with and they would chase and have the dog chase them. Some of them have kids of varying ages where we would use them to do it, because obviously these were things that were in their household. Some players are single players and obviously don't see anyone. So all of a sudden we had to do some more of the things that were maybe more reductionist, more isolated from, and it wasn't highly representative, but yet they were still having an opportunity to solve certain problems within their environment. Maybe it was more of that animalistic type of movement. It was interacting with affordances in different ways. We were changing surfaces. We were changing how they were connecting to the information, even if the information wasn't quote unquote alive. And then we were also doing some of the things that Keith would probably suggest in the ASM around parkour, how they would interact with being able to change their movement style or their movement execution based on the changing landscape. And I think that's really what it is. This is the crux of this topic, at least for me. This generality and specific dichotomy or relationship that we want to make, this marriage between them, is still about how the individual is interacting with that affordance landscape and organizing their movement solutions to be more functionally fit to that landscape, and how we can find ways to make it match more closely. That it isn't just about the action fidelity per se, but it still has to be about the perceptual degrees of freedom and the intentional degrees of freedom, and then finally the actions in exploring a wide range of being able to solve those respective problems. So I think there's some really key parts in there, specifically when players aren't allowed to be around their teammates or opponents, and that maybe would act exactly like it. But your point, Keith, to it being skill maintenance for those individuals, and it could just be enough to get us through, I think is an important one.
Yeah, I think that there's some really good points. And yeah, the other thing, you're talking kind of in the context of what's going on now, and that's kind of what we want to talk about. But I also wanted to feedback from. I think it's also valuable. Am I getting feedback and sound from?
No, you're all right. I can hear.
Okay.
You're okay.
Okay, I can hear myself. Sorry. So I think what we're doing now is kind of moving along one direction, right? We're stuck in our backyard with a tennis ball and a stick, and we have to try to think, how can I make this more closer to my sport? But I think back when the world gets back to normal, hopefully, I think, Keith, also a point you would make is it's valuable to do this in normal times too. The phrase I've been, deliberately violating kind of representative, like deliberately moving away from the real thing for a reason, right? You want to enhance and amplify an affordance, constrain, so I think it's important to think about moving both from the completely general, trying to, because we always say, how representative should you be? As representative as possible, which is not very useful to people as a guidance. But I think you want to think about why you're not representative. Why, if you have everything available to you, why are you not using the game exactly like the game? I think that's really helpful.
It's a key point. So go back to that continuum,
Yeah.
and a key issue is obviously there's no right or wrong side. It depends on the individual needs, and a coach or practitioner or support team need to be able to articulate why one individual is based at one side or at one location on the continuum, and why another individual needs to spend a little bit more time at another end of the continuum. And Rob, just picking up that point, I think we can learn a lot from what's happening at the moment of this sort of, and this is why it's timely, this notion of athlete enrichment and the nuanced balance between specificity and generality of practice, because there's going to be other occasions, maybe not as drastic, hopefully, as this pandemic situation, but things through illness and other illnesses, aging, long-term decrements and long-term gaps in an individual's opportunity to practice in an ordinary way. It might be something to do with, for example, after this, some people are talking about a financial issue that may emerge in society, and sports obviously being part of society. There may be players who are out of contract and not with an organization, hopefully not, but then they've got to maintain their skills and practice in a certain way while a contract comes along. So there may be things that we can learn about this enrichment idea that we can use in future less drastic situations, I think.
Yeah, I agree completely, Keith. From everything I've seen people posting online about their backyard game, the word people are using that I think is totally appropriate. So not only do you need to understand the principles and representative design and how to do this effectively, you need to be incredibly creative as a coach. So I think it's bringing out creativity in both coaches and athletes right now that I agree I think this will be beneficial in the long run after this is over. Yeah, Shawn,
Sorry, Shawn. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that it certainly has been that way for me. Even my players who are allowed to come to me right now, which would be my return to performance players who are maybe in late stages of their rehab. So they have some certain allowance to be able to, for us to be able to get out on the field. Even then, we don't want to violate some of these stay-at-home type orders or some of the recommendations, right? So I've had to look at things for myself as a sport movement specialist. My lens has had to change in a little different way as well to try to find movement problems that do allow a certain amount of space, because we don't want to, between myself and being the opponent and presenting a certain problem to the performer, I don't want to put him at risk or myself at risk, vice versa. So I've had to think about things in movement on a football field in a little different way as well, trying to look for that 2-yard or 6-foot window and trying to see problems that may exist there between the problem and solution dynamics or between the opponent and then myself. And so I can speak for myself in that practical way that it has forced me to become more creative, even in my representative task design or something that could be constraining to afford or more of a slice of the game in those one-on-one interactions. And then additionally, from a practitioner perspective, I'm also seeing like my remote clients or my remote athletes, those individuals I'm forced to be more creative, like I already mentioned, but I'm starting to see where I could potentially use those things later on when they are at times when they're maybe away from me. Maybe that player plays in Seattle and I'm going to be in Minnesota, but there's certain things that I can have him do to maintain the skill throughout the season or in then coming off at different times of the year as well. So I think those are all really highly valid points.
Yeah, I mean, one example that I forgot, I left out actually, it comes from my experience of working in Australia in academia, and I became aware of the issue for some developing athletes is that they often lived in rural backgrounds. So it might be, for example, a couple of 100 miles from a big city like Sydney or Melbourne, and often the rural communities there, but I mean small towns, small villages, they have a great love of sport. You know, I visited plenty of these places on holiday, and when my kids were young, we could always find somewhere to kick a ball around and run around and stuff. You know, they had lovely facilities and things like that. And it struck me that at that time is that you know, this is not a case of just every Tuesday and Thursday evening you go along to training. These kids, you know, who got a bit of identified with a bit of potential, they could struggle to play with the numbers that were needed, you know, to sort of get these different small-sided games going on. And it might be a case of a lot of time being spent in unstructured play in 2s and 3s, etc., challenging themselves. And so they become good at these games. And so that innovation and creativity, I would love if one of the things that happened is that coaches actually started to say, you know, I like this idea of being a bit more innovative and challenging myself, and not necessarily just following what it says in the manual, but I like really coming up with new things that challenge learners in a meaningful way, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's great. And you're right. We have a lot of people like Shawn that are doing it already, but I think, you know, I think it's good. Hopefully this inspires more people to move that direction. I guess turning to we've touched on this a little bit, but I know listening to seeing the feedback from your presentation, Keith, I know part of it that really struck a chord with a lot of people was this learn to move concept. I think that resonated with a lot of people. And we mentioned, so let's dive into that. I want to start with synergies. Maybe we can talk a little bit, you know, for those that don't know what we mean. So you're talking about synergy kind of in the Bernstein coordinating degrees of freedom kind of way? Is that when you're talking about developing synergies? Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, what I like about Bernstein's insights, and remember, you know, you've got to remember this guy. He was really kind of very good at multiple things. So he was a physiologist. He was a movement scientist. You know, very rigorous in his approach. But his work got translated into English in 1967. But he actually did a lot of this in the 1930s. You know, a lot of these ideas way ahead of his time, like that. And so he really, I don't think I'm exaggerating in this, but he sort of was quite responsible for helping movement scientists to understand the importance of coordination. Before that, we'd talked about movement control or motor control, and that was kind of driven by the idea that there's some sort of internalized representational memory that controlled the movements, and when we practice, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to develop those. But he emphasized coordination, and he talked about, you've got this on the one hand, I suppose you can interpret it as a curse or a blessing. You've got all these motor system degrees of freedom, parts of the body, muscles, joints, limb segments, a wonderful resource, but it's a bit of a challenge, because you've also got to understand which ones need tight coordination in order to achieve a particular task goal. And that's what we mean by functionality, being able to function. So if you want to get your hand in the way of a ball traveling past and you want to time the interception, or if you want to get your hand out of the way, you know, you coordinate your actions in different ways. So coordination isn't just about reorganizing the body, parts of the body, but it's, as Shawn's mentioned and you've mentioned as well, Rob, it's about reorganizing the motor system degrees of freedom with respect to what's going on in the environment, the information in the environment. So that's what we refer to when we talk about this perception, action, relationships. So synergy formation, Bernstein drew our attention to, is a fundamental basis of an individual's interaction with the environment.
Mm-hmm. I know Shawn will have some thoughts on this.
This is the exact moment that I was waiting for in this conversation, obviously. You know, but I think there is something to that learning to learn to move idea really does start to summarize many of Bernstein's ideas from 1967, which were obviously written much earlier. That was just a translation and coordination and regulation of movements. But in that famous repetition without repetition excerpt that everyone talks about, right? That learning to essentially repeat the movement solution isn't about the means of the solution, but it's in the process of solving that problem again and again. So again, it becomes about the performer and the environment, the problem and the solution. And there in those solution dynamics, this process of solving that problem again and again, we're essentially adjusting those degrees of freedom across the dimensions of the human movement system. Like Keith mentioned, it's not just the motor system degrees of freedom. It's not just the action. It's the perception intertwining with that action in order for us to attune and adapt. And I think there we start to find ideas of scanning or exploring to be able to compose that movement solution to be the most functionally fit to what the problem is offering us. And I think there we learn to interact, we learn to exchange information with the environment. And now we see where Bernstein's ideas really weren't that far off from maybe what Gibson was saying with information and our movement being coupled to it. Because I think that's where the marriage of ecological dynamics from an ecological psychology and dynamical systems or coordination dynamic side kind of start to marry or intermix with one another. And I think that, for me, that learning to learn to move starts to summarize that entire process of repetition without repetition.
Yeah.
That really well put. And I think learning to learn to move is, we mustn't think that this idea is, oh yeah, that's quite important as an infant or a young child. Learning to learn to move is something that goes throughout the life course. And so you are constantly challenged to reorganize system degrees of freedom into functional synergies, because we're a nonlinear system, we're constantly changing as well. It's maturation, development, it could be aging, injuries, illness, all these effects. That's the basis of adaptation or skill adaptation, learning to learn to move. So I think it's a really good thing that, and I mentioned in the questions from the last presentation, which I remember I see as part of a trilogy that, and Shawn, your conference is the third part, so.
All right.
But essentially that adaptation is important, and even at the elderly stage, when quite frankly, a lot of people, their motor systems are kind of trying to shut down, if you like, their dimensionality, they're being compressed. They've got to keep working at trying to keep that open, keep the flexibility there, keep the synergy formation going. And so, as I mentioned in Leeds City Council before the lockdown in the UK, they had a program for parkour for elderly, 6-week program. And obviously it's parkour style training and there are lots of support there for people. But the idea is it's keeping people moving, it's synergy formation or reformation, and it's fun. It's fun and enjoyment as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think those are great points. Like, so the synergy, I'll get back the example. The way that I think of it is a real kind of lower level. So when I kick a soccer ball, I need to learn to coordinate how I bend my hip, knee, and ankle, right? And a synergy is when I make, for example, my knee and ankle work together in a functional way. They adjust, compensate for each other. What that allows me to do is, transfer energy more effectively. I can kick the ball harder. If someone moves the ball a little bit while I'm in the middle of my kick, I can adapt because they're functionally compensating for each other. So I think that's, what we mean by synergy, this functional relationship between these degrees of freedom. Yeah. Yeah. And this maybe a bit more speculative, so when we learning, another way that I might phrase this is learn to solve movement problems, right? You're learning to solve problems. You're learning problem solving about movement. What do you think we're learning there that actually maybe, I don't know if transfer is the best word, that carries over to others' tasks? What do you think maybe what do we learn when we learn to move, Shawn? Do you have we don't know. This is something, we're trying to understand.
Yeah, I think first off, we can look at those dimensions of the human movement system and those respective processes that I think are going to intertwine to form that functional behavioral unit known as sort of this movement solution or movement problem solving process. And then I think there, for me, I come back to ideas of Jacobs and Michaels with direct learning. which would be the education of attention, the education of intention, or then the calibration of one's movement to the information in our action capabilities. So I think at least that's where my mind is immediately drawn to. We learn to be able to scan more effectively. We learn to be able to find specifying information that could pertain to our intentions. We learn to, or evolve to a certain degree within these environments to become more attuned to that specifying information, but we also learn to differentiate between information sources and what it may mean to us. I think in the calibration side, we learn to calibrate our action capabilities based on, we know that those are not fixed, of course, like Keith had already mentioned, over a longer time scale, but even over the more micro time scale, they're also not going to be fixed and we're going to be changing. So I think all of that sort of intertwines, if you will, to form this, what we may be learning or what we may be learning to do within our movement problem solving process. At least that's kind of where my mind goes: education of attention, education of intention, and then potential calibration.
Yeah. And for me, I think that's a good response, Shawn. And for me, that's why it would be good for coaches, practitioners to think of individuals interacting with the environment. So with Bernstein emphasizing coordination, and coordination having two dimensions: the reorganization of motor system degrees of freedom, i.e. coordination of parts of the body, but also coordination of parts of the body with respect to the environment, what's going on in the environment. So what it means is that you get a less of a focus on action and more on interaction, continuously interacting with the environment, because the environment's not static, it's dynamic, and even at the most rudimentary level of sport performance, physical activity environment, it's changing. It's changing. It's information is coming up, and you can use it to enhance your functionality, to achieve your task goals, or you can be selective with it and not pay attention to it. And certainly at that elite level, the higher you go, people work you out. You've got these performance analytics now working as part of these big, huge departments of methodology, working together with strength and conditioning coaches, skill acquisition coaches. And so someone who bursts onto the scene as a top performer, very quickly, there are images of that individual and people are trying to work out what the strengths and weaknesses are and that sort of thing. And so you have to keep reinventing yourself in order to stay relevant and current. If you don't, you'll be found out, and essentially you won't be as functional, as effective as you have been in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really money point, because specifically for me, obviously in my particular or peculiar learning environment, this is essentially how I try to partner up with athletes into finding those opportunities or those gaps within their movement skill where they could find ways to solve those problems more functionally, but also then in different ways, essentially adding to those abundant degrees of freedom at every one of those dimensional levels. Again, different ways to solve similar movement problems, but also how those movement solutions then may match up across varying movement problems, sort of the idea of Bernstein's dexterity, or the ability to solve any emerging movement problem under any situation in any condition. I think that's where, if we talk about how to facilitate this learning to learn to move process, sort of going or surfing this bandwidth of problem variability, I think is a really important concept to unpack as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe turning to that how we can design practice to help develop this. I think also I really like the point you guys were making about this. We tend, the key point you're making, Keith, that we think about this as learn to move as a developmental children's issue, but adaptability and learning to adapt is your whole life. As an athlete, a professional athlete, as Shawn knows, you're gonna get slower. You're gonna be less flexible. You have to come up with new ways to solve. You're gonna get injured. And you're going to have new ways to solve problems all the time. So it's not, but how do we facilitate this in practice, do you think? You hinting, Shawn, you were mentioning.
I would love to hear Keith's answer.
Yeah.
Obviously, my synopsis, my short, hopefully short, concise answer would be to be able to expose the athlete to tremendous variability in situations as well as conditions. Now, how big of bandwidth or manifold or that we're talking about there, that remains to be seen, because I don't think we can necessarily define that quite yet, depending on the sport, of course. But that's just where my mind goes. If I'm thinking about aiming for more functional movement problem solving, I'm aiming for dexterity ultimately. I'm aiming for skill attunement and skill adaptability. For me, I have to expose them to more situations, as well as then across differences in environmental conditions.
Exactly. And, there's a couple of points to make there. Firstly, that it's about setting problems. It's about asking athletes to make choices, to make decisions, challenging them, find different ways of doing things. And I don't mean that in a you can do it in an open way. I think with young children in school physical education, you can do that sort of show me different ways of doing this. I don't actually mean that with older athletes and more specialist athletes. I'm talking about setting them challenges and problems. Sometimes when I've gone in and talked to coaches, some coaches will say, oh yeah, I can understand that for team games. But, my sport, it could be archery or, shooting. Things don't vary. I said, well, they do. I mean, just tell me what varies. Well, the temperature varies. The wind direction, that varies and sometimes there's a bit of a slope angle, and there you go straight away. So this notion that this is only relevant for highly dynamic sports and contexts, even if things vary just a little bit, that's your your tolerance bandwidth for designing practice tasks. But there is always variability in every sport, because we don't operate in a vacuum.
Yeah, and like Bernstein said, there's variability inside of us too, in the external environment, right?
Good point.
We're starting to get some questions, and anyone else that if you want to submit them, here's one. I think it touches on something we were just talking about. I think it applies to both yours, football, Shawn, and maybe soccer. Some of the things you've done. So question is, what is more important in training, decision making or tactical training? So I think probably first of all, we wouldn't want to pose that as an or.
I was going to say that looks like a dualism there.
Yeah. So I think this is a good example of. So Shawn, you may that's it, but how do you train both? Like the lineman you work with, you could call decision making is in the moment. Where do I rush? What versus tactic is what defense am I playing on this play? Who am I? So how do you kind of fit those together in training?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there to start. Obviously, they should be more interrelated because they are always going to emerge in an interrelated fashion, right? The movement problem and solution dynamics are going to interact accordingly. And there's going to be all these respective degrees of freedom, not only from the performer, but again, with the environment as well. And I think we have to make sure that we don't separate them. We think the intentions are going to act as this link in this scaffolding for what we perceive and how we may potentially act, right? If our intentions are going to be our aims to act in a given way, and our tactical behaviors or strategies are going to play into that, those are certainly things that we have to factor for. I personally don't think that we can separate them and say one is more important than the other, because they are equally important, just as the performer and the environment are equally performant to one another. They have mutual reciprocal relationship, just as the problem and the solution are going to always be connected, just as the perceptions and the intentions and actions are always going to be connected. And so I think our intentions may be driven by our tactical strategy, but they are going to certainly plan for what information we search for, what that information then means, and what those affordances are going to be specified based on our action capabilities and our actions intentions. So I think that's, for me, we just don't want to separate them, because they're always going to be, as Rob would say, coupled.
I agree with that. I think they're deeply integrated. And it might be the case that decision making might be at one level considered to be more fundamental, a fundamental basis of performance. You're interacting with the environment, the practice environment. but it's manifest in tactical situations. So, for example, in individual sports, it might be a case of, for example, if you're looking at a climb of a vertical surface, then you're working out where's your route. If it's a speed climb, then what's the quickest way I can get up there, the safest way, the ones where I'm not going to make any errors, etc. So that kind of is where decision making feeds into the tactical side of things. For team games, against the higher the level you perform, you will not just have a sort of one tactical plan in mind. You'll have to adapt your tactics because good opponents will set you problems all the time. And so you have to make decision making. One thing I'd like to add from that perspective is a very good colleague of mine, João Ribeiro, University of Porto in Portugal. And I've got some very good collaborators there, Patricia Coutinho and Pedro Silva, Julio Giganta. João Ribeiro and I, we talked about this notion of the synergy formation being influenced in what we call a bi-directional way. So while you do have a coach's input, we talked about that as a global influence, that's like an external influence. You need that. On field, where it's sometimes difficult to communicate and there's not enough breaks in the game of play, and you need to be able to adapt very quickly if there's a problem on field for whatever reason, you need that local to global direction as well. So local synergy formation or decision making needs to be going on there, and that can only happen if you empower the players and you also practice it in training. So that, for example, let's take a simple example of a gymnastics routine. You may have you're in a gymnastics team, you're coming on fourth or fifth, and you're on a particular event, and you have a conservative performance where you're protecting a lead. I'm going to do this. It's not going to score, really highly. It's not very risk-taking. But you also have that risk-taking one where you're chasing. You're trying to get into the medal positions, and being able to switch between them quite quickly is, if you like, a sort of a decision-making tactical thing. In training, if I were a coach, I would leave the athlete guessing as late as possible what type of routine they're going to perform. You might even tell them, right, do you want to practice your conservative routine? Then on the way say, no, come on, no, we're going to go for it. It's because it's that mindset of adapting to what's going on at a particular point. And the better adapters are the ones that can make those decisions quite quickly. And of course, they can adjust their tactics, if you like.
Yeah, no, I think those are both great examples. And in going like the team sport, he mentioned soccer. The way that I would think of it, well, first of all, I think we always want decision-making component in training. And especially if we think about decisions in the ecological way as not explicit choices, I think they're always, as Keith said, even in the sports that seem to be low variability, there's still decisions in the ecological sense. And for me, tactics like in soccer, or you can think about it in training, are a constraint posed by the coach. I want you to play defensive this time. I want you to play offensive. I want you to try to go over the top. And so I think you want the decision making there, and then constraints of tactics are something you can manipulate in practice, like a constraints manipulation. Watch people make decisions when you want them to move the ball up the field versus protect the lead. Those are things I think are good to manipulate in practice, is the way that I would think about them.
Very good. I mean, it could be, take that example, Rob. In a game, you might be protecting a lead, so you bring a player back and you have more players at the back. You play a different system. It could be 5 at the back, 3 midfield, 2 up front, or a 4-5-1, that sort of thing. Or you're chasing. You have to chase the lead. And so you're going to play just 3 at the back. And your players need to be able to switch between those flexibly within the game situation. Rather than just, because in football, as everybody knows, there's no timeout. There's no kind of timeout. Let's call you to the side and let's talk you through this, etc. So the players have got to be able to adapt like that.
Yeah, I think that's something kind of underutilized I see in coaching is the use of kind of vignettes or scenarios. You play an athlete, this is the bottom of the ninth, 2 out from my sport, Shawn, do you do any kind of that thing with your athletes? This is third
Yeah.
down.
Yeah, I do.
Obviously, you rush differently than first down. Yeah.
Yeah, because obviously, even if we're trying to advocate for this honest, authentic, creative expression of a movement problem solving process for the performer, some of that is going to be dictated by situational constraints. Some of it will be dictated by environmental constraints. It's why I try to expose them to as many of those different scenarios or combination and contexts as I possibly can. Because certainly, let's say if we use the lineman example, the defensive end rushing the passer, it's going to be considerably different depending on what down and distance it is. His strategy his intention, his global intention is going to change there. And then his local interactions are obviously going to change as well, those more micro interactions, because that will probably determine how his opponent behaves to a certain degree. A running back, I got Barry Sanders right there behind me, the greatest, most masterful, most dexterous mover that my sport has ever seen, to my opinion. And it's funny because in his top 100 video, when they're interviewing him, they ask him essentially why he was able to make people miss the way that he was. And he simply said, I just went in with this intention to basically not get tackled. I was trying to perfect the art of making people miss regardless of what down or distance it was. Like at a certain point, that information becomes so alive, that complexity becomes so great, and you're out there adapting, and that's really that's where your attunement is driven, that's where your intentions are driven, and your actions will obviously follow that, and how those degrees of freedom are formed. So at a certain point you're going to be in the fire, and you have to be able to adapt, I guess is my point.
Yeah. We got another question here. There's a part to this before this, but basically what they were kind of echoing Keith's comments of lamenting kind of how we're losing skilled movers over time as kids play less, get less chances to solve problems and be spontaneous. And this is a really big question, but ideas on how we can change this moving forward. I think we touched on a little bit, but any thoughts on that? Maybe Keith.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think is really important. So these ideas that I've been talking about in terms of skill adaptation and enrichment, they are not just relevant for elite sports and development athletes, but they're also relevant for people learning across the lifespan, which we've mentioned. So in a sense, what we should be talking about is physical literacy here, the concept that I'm not a fan of the term because it seems to emphasize physical side of things, but there's this emotional, there's social interaction, there's psychological, cognitive, perceptual. So really it's about, it starts with families, it starts with parents, and instilling a love of movement in the kids and opportunities to move. And I don't know about you guys, but my kids were they were so competitive. They loved competing, and it was just a case of channeling that so that they competed against themselves rather than against each other, sort of thing. And so setting problems, questions, issues, choices, decisions, and little games, introducing play, lots of play and fun and enjoyment where the outcome was movement oriented rather than a verbal response and, that sort of thing. And so it starts in the family. It starts then, obviously the schools, and focus on physical literacy more in schools, and understanding that goes right across the lifespan. I'd like to see some development programs and elite programs also understand the beauty, the joy of fun and play, even with professional athletes. They're still, you at the moment, I don't know whether you've seen the figures, but there's some figures from professional football showing that depression or reported depression has risen in this lockdown. Players, even at that level, they like to play. They miss playing the game, and let's not forget that. So I think all of those things can help us to maintain focus on, keeping people moving and just remembering what it's like, the sheer joy of movement at these times.
Yeah, I think I'll get a shot. I think something that could be really informative for this that I've kind of really liked hearing about is the work that's been done, some of the case studies and examinations of things like soccer in Brazil, looking at how kids play, the environments they play and how they develop kind of their own rules, their own, they police each other. I think looking at that and seeing, I think some of that work is really nice and shows you how these, sometimes we let kids be sometimes not having perfect environments, right? As you said, Keith, not always going to the gym, try playing over here and there. And I think all these things, giving this variability and problem solving we talked about. Shawn, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many golden nuggets there that we could take, I think, from both of your points. To the question, it was a question that I actually even wrote down while listening to Keith live. I said something along, how can us as practitioners, whether it's in ecological dynamics or whether it's across different theories, how can we inform or assist those who are trying to move more? What types of principles are important? What types of concepts are important in general to be able to move more and to do so more functionally in one's life, not just in physical education when that quote unquote literacy is building, but also to maintain that over the lifespan. And I think something you said there, Keith, resonated with me in particular with professional athletes in their lack of joy of movement sometimes. Sometimes their bodies are so used to going through really repetitive motions, obviously, that their body starts to break down. Many players, when they first get to me, they might have been playing American football at a relatively high level for a significant period of time, and they were told a certain way to move, but yet it hurts them to move that way. And so when we just open things up and allow them to move more generally sometimes, maybe more in more novel ways as well, they start to figure out other solutions. They start to figure out how to organize those degrees of freedom in different ways to bypass some of those constraints. And they start to find their love of movement again. And that's actually where my theme for 2019 with my entire learning environment, which was oriented around that Bruce Lee idea of honestly expressing oneself. I told them throughout all of our movement problems, that was our main objective. And I saw their joy jump up through the roof. Like anything we did, I wanted them to express themselves. I wanted them to be authentic. I wanted their personality to show in the way that they were solving movement problems. And I believe then that kind of drives some of that joy as well. It allows them to go out and create with their movement. We all love doing that to a certain degree.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, that's good. We have another question here I'll put up. How much should we take into account the notion that experts are best at reading, observing their opponent's strengths and weaknesses, and how can we immerse this into team practice? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that obviously is an important part of expertise. If you're going it to the highest level, it's about picking up information from the environment. And so I guess if I'm interpreting this question correctly, it's about helping players, putting them in different situations against different opponents, and then encouraging them and facilitating them in picking up information from the environment. This information action or perception action relationship is so important, really. And I think one of the issues is that probably we become a bit too bogged down in augmented information, augmented feedback from an external source, this global to local direction, rather than encouraging them, facilitating them to actually pick up information through interactions. And you do that through performing against different individuals and making sure they've got wide experience, so that, even if they're playing against people with maverick type of movement patterns and action behaviors, that's a good thing, that's helpful for people. And so you kind of help people to read what's going on. And also, don't forget, they'll come across people who are really good at deception, at hiding what their intentions are. So that will be an important aspect of their development, depending on how far you go. So this, that for me, that touches on this notion that the information that's present in environment, whether it's surrounding energy arrays from the landscape, or whether it's focused from the movements of an opponent, that's quite important. That's a very important skill. So scanning, Shawn, you talked about that, really important, visual exploratory behaviors, but not just vision, acoustic information and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, Keith. I probably can't say I can't add a whole heck of a lot, because I think you did summarize it really well. because I do take into account the notion that expert players can quote unquote read or observe their opponent's strengths and weaknesses better than others. And I wouldn't necessarily use the word reading per se. I would say that they perceptually connect to, or they attune to, right? That specifying information that exists there, this informational link, that energy exchange between the solver and the problem, or between oneself and one's opponent, I think is so vital. But what you summarize there and how we might be able to facilitate that through practice is exactly that. I think that wide range of situations, wide range of opponents who you do know are going to go in with deceptive measures in order to beat that respective individual. I think even just changing things such as the space that we have to work with. There, obviously, we create different time constraints for that performer. And now we put strengths and weaknesses against one another, myself versus an opponent. And then obviously the number of opponents will sort of translate into that as well. When we start to talk about numbers of opponents, it obviously changes the complexity of that problem for that team sport performer to solve, right? Especially if we're talking about one person versus another, or 1 versus 2, or 2 versus 2, or 2 versus 4 or 5, whatever it may be. And I think, at least that's for me personally, I'm biased, of course, that's how repetition without repetition, in these sort of like constraining to afford slices that I create for my individual performers, even though I don't have 11 on 11, I create these snippets or slices of the game in exactly that way to allow that performer to become attuned to the potential specifying informational variables that could be existent there, and hopefully start to be able to perceive, differentiate, or become sensitive to those respective movement behaviors from their opponents.
Yeah, no, not surprisingly, you both took all my points. I would make. But what I would say is, recognizing weaknesses is basically picking up information, right? Picking up information that opponent puts more weight on one side than the other. Is detecting weakness, you can go around the other side. So you're totally right. You need to interact. No way you can learn that without interaction. And Shawn, I think you put the nail on the head. A lot of team sports players don't get many opportunities to learn this, right? They don't get tons of individual one-on-one interactions, like you said, Keith, with really deceptive players. So this is really an opportunity for constraining to enhance this information by reducing space, giving lots of opportunities. So yeah, I think that. Maybe one more question. I'm not quite sure what the person, the Francisco, is asking here, but I have an idea. In training skills, there should be some kind of fixed points to be considered. What's your approach selecting constraints that invite to find or explore them?
Yeah, if I've understood this correctly, it's a question of guided discovery. In other words, there are fixed things that you might be working on, but they don't want to be too fixed, because obviously, as a coach, you might have these coaching points that you're going to go through. And the learner is really it's going off in a different direction, and the learning process, the learning moment, you don't want to miss that. Equally, if you do a lot of exploratory discovery learning, that can require a lot of time and effort, because potentially across the whole landscape, the learner could be searching all over, and it could take a long time to discover things. So in a sense, the coach can be the guide. And the athlete could be finding their way, a process of wayfinding, so almost like navigating the way through the landscape. But you don't want the coach to act like a GPS system, basically say, right, the next turn right, next 400 yards or whatever, that sort of thing. It's more about these fixed points where the coach could just change things or focus things working on an athlete. So it could be, I don't know, dribbling in football, or a certain hand grip in hand and foot grip in climbing, or something like that. But this is important from the point of view of what we call co-design. This is something I'm working on with colleagues Carl Woods and James Rudd and Marco Sullivan. We talk about co-designing. That's where the athlete and coach works together on issues, and that may be where the fixed points emerge, rather than the coach impose the fixed point and say, today we're going to work on this. It'd be in terms of engagement process, it would be good to include the athlete as well.
Shawn?
Well, and I think, again, if I'm understanding his question correctly along the lines of what Keith had mentioned, obviously our informational constraints that are of the augmented sort, our guidance and our communication, our instructions and our feedback can sort of guide this attentional search for those respective fixed points. If we're talking about certain kinematic KPIs or shapes or things like that in the actual motor pattern degrees of freedom. But I think even, and Rob, we've talked about this before as well, guiding the actual perceptual search is something that I think is an important under-discussed topic as well, how we as a coach could potentially facilitate that search. So we maybe guide them on where to look, but not necessarily tell them exactly what to see or what something could feel like, but not necessarily what it has to feel like or how it has to be executed. And I think that's where like this ecological dynamics perspective on one's authentic movement signature over or is in opposition to this idealistic technical model of execution sort of enters the mix, because I think what we're after there, we are after authenticity within the entirety of that movement solution. That doesn't mean that we violate or attempt to violate certain biomechanical KPIs or characteristics that might make the movement solution more efficient or obviously more power producing or whatever it may be. But really what we're after there is trying to find how close within a certain bandwidth of that execution we can be and just facilitate their execution towards that.
Yeah, no, the really good points. What it brought to mind to me was, in our kind of approach, we emphasize the variability, the adaptability. That's not to the variance. That's not to deny there's also invariance in movement, right? There's commonalities between the way skilled performers move. Otherwise, we wouldn't call this throwing and this kicking. There was nothing in common between them, right? So identifying the common elements between skilled movers and making sure they're present as a coach, is important. But I think your point is right, Keith. That's not all there is to it, right? We don't want everybody doing exactly the same. That makes up some proportion of what we want, but not nearly all of it, I think is what I point out.
And that's what I meant. That's it. That's a good point, Rob. And that's what I meant really about this notion that we don't want to, as coaches, practitioners, we don't want to act as a sat nav or a GPS device to guide explicitly every step of the way, but more as a mentor and a guide which facilitates the search. Because from as I mentioned in the previous talk, ecological dynamics practice is a search, and so where you search on that affordance landscape, that might be where the fixed points coming from Francisco's question.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. So I think we better wrap it up now. If this was the real context I set out at the start, being after a conference for a meal or a drink, I'm sure we could keep this going until the closing time and they kicked us out. Happily, it would be fun. But maybe some, I don't know if you have any last thoughts about anything we talked about more generalized training, this situation we're in now, something to think about. Anything you kind of want to say as a closing, Keith?
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm, with some colleagues, I'm working on a paper at the moment, and we're going to try and get this out. But it's going to be a very applied science paper where we're going to refer to the theory. So if you go back to those dualisms, we're going to refer to some of the fundamental science and the theoretical ideas, but we're going to look at the practical applications of them with respect to athlete enrichment. I think that this is a very important aspect, and maybe not even call it athlete enrichment, but individual enrichment, because that then covers across the lifespan, and even people that are not going to specialize in high-level sports. And that was raised in one of the questions there. This is important for people who want to be good movers and keep moving and be active throughout the lifespan. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. And these discussions are so valuable, and the questions obviously as well, they're so valuable in just sort of getting the thinking right and seeing where things insert. So yeah, for me, this is quite exciting. So.
Shawn?
Yeah, and I guess on my end, sort of echoing what Keith had to say there as well, as we all attempt to exist between the science and the art, or between the theory and then the actual practical application of it, I think as we learn to exist there, probably one of the themes that came up over the last hour and 15 minutes, I hope for those listeners out there, would be to think about movement as this problem-solving activity, right? And the more we can think about it as the problem-solving activity, the more we start to think about the role of the environment and the information that exists there, and how we might be able to set up environments that are going to facilitate more functional movement problem solving for our performers or for our individuals, regardless of where they fit within that time scale or what activity it is that's important to them. And so I think for me, that's probably the biggest theme that I hope others were able to take from it as well. That movement is a problem-solving activity, and that means the performer and the environment have this mutual reciprocal relationship, and we must often think about it, regardless if we're talking general or specific, and anywhere in between there.
Yeah, no, great points. And I think for me, I think, this is not only well-timed, this topic you're bringing up, Keith, for the situation we're in, but also I think some of the things it addresses are the kind of concerns the issues people have raised with ecological dynamics and more broadly. Where does the more general stuff fit in? Where does the tactical stuff fit in? I think it addresses some of that nicely. So before I sign off, I just wanted to, so for those that, if you haven't seen Keith's talk on with the Movement Science Ireland, Skill Acquisition Ireland group, is still up on YouTube. And I just wanted, a couple of people asked Shawn about, can you give a quick plug for the SMSC coming up?
Yes, I certainly can. And obviously both Keith and Rob have so graciously offered their expertise. And obviously I wouldn't have it any other way to have them as part of it. Right now, the live event itself is set towards a certain amount of participants or seats. It will be packaged in some way, shape, or form. I'm still kind of working through how that's going to look or what that's going to look like. We're going to try to keep the event itself, for those individuals who had already signed up for the live event, to keep the interactions to be high, to have an intimate sort of meeting room, if you will. But we're looking at ways, and then that will sort of suffice across the community, if you will, how we might be able to get the information out there for others to be able to see as well. But that's taking place May 16th and 17th. It will, right now we're currently full, but we're looking at ways to be able to pass that on to the community later on.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both very much. And for those, listening, there'll be more of these coming down the pipe eventually. That was a lot of fun. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, good.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks. Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Kick it.